At the same time, geopolitical conflicts are intensifying. Sanctions, tariffs, and decoupling strategies are reshaping global supply chains. For India, these dynamics highlight both vulnerability and resilience. For developing countries, this is a necessity, not just a romantic aspiration. We cannot afford to be passive spectators. In a world where decisions elsewhere determine our destinies, we must be active participants, shaping outcomes where possible and preserving autonomy where necessary. Today, we find ourselves in a shifting global landscape that resembles a zero-sum approach, in part, a consequence of the failures and limitations of the era of globalization that preceded it. Good morning and welcome to this fourth edition, in which the Institute of Economic Growth and the Ministry of Finance are together holding the fourth edition. And I thank Shri N.K. Singh for persistently building on edition after edition. The gathering and the domain of experts with whom he gets in touch and brings them over has absolutely meaningful participation, and the outcomes have always been very useful for all of us to see where our next steps should lie. So in that regard, the fourth edition for me gives me the confidence that Indian policy making is guided by a good churn at the conclave, and the outcomes have not just helped in our policy making but also in holding global conferences, and the G20 of 2023 stands out as a classic example, where with some hope we were still able to get thinking heads and observers together to talk about the pressing issues as we saw then, which continue to be pressing issues today, of reforming the multilateral institutions. N.K. Singh did make an observation that further and further dilution of multilateral institutions is chiseling away, if I can say, or chipping away the confidence the global community had that somehow we will be able to come around to strengthening these institutions, because they were the ones which held out during times of need. However, with these thoughts at the back of our minds, let me formally give my thoughts here, which largely pertain to the global situation which a country like India, aspiring to take a twin-track approach to this seeking of prosperity, which has been long denied to us. Not denied by anybody else, but denied by factors which didn't help us to project and move faster, some of our own making and some global situations and the uncertainties. But today, Honorable Prime Minister has actually set the two-track in motion, one being reaching by 2047 a position where you're able to say that you're a developed country, Vikasit Bharat. If that is one of the track, the other track is how do you reach that unless you are Atmanirbhar, unless you're self-reliant. Largely, it does not for a moment mean that we want to shut our economy and make ourselves look inward. So if the twin track is ready before us, and we will have to not go on a speed which in terms of numbers at 4, at 5, at 5.5 of GDP, but reach 8% of GDP is the one which can give us the speed to reach the destination by 2047. So with that as a background largely, I'd like to say that it gives me great pleasure to be here among such an esteemed gathering. And I'd like to extend my congratulations to N.K. Singh, the President of Institute of Economic Growth, and Dr. Sabyasachi Kar, Director of the Institute of Economic Growth, for convening the 4th edition of the Kautilya Economic Enclave. We are in an era of unprecedented global uncertainty and volatility. This conclave provides an invaluable opportunity to bring together distinguished economists and policymakers, sharing ideas and engaging in meaningful discussions to solve critical common challenges which most nations face. Is absolutely responsibility that this gathering cannot shirk away. The theme before us, seeking prosperity in troubled times or turbulent times, mirrors the aspirations of each one of the nations and the world as a whole who are looking to get out of this uncertainty. So we gather at a time when the very foundation of the global order are shifting beneath our feet. The world that emerged after the end of the Cold War, which led to the expansion of globalization, open markets, and the pursuit of multilateral cooperation, now appears to be a relic of the past. For 3 decades, a contested equilibrium allowed nations to pursue prosperity through integration and interdependence. That equilibrium has inevitably been upended, and the rules of international engagement are being rewritten, stating that the present is turbulent in some sense would be an understatement. The scale of the challenge which is in our hand is rather too big, so we will be understating the scale of the challenge at hand. What we face is not a temporary disruption, but a structural transformation. The question, therefore, is, and this is something on which I will request the gathering to ponder and come out with some answers, because none of what I'm going to say are answers to the problem which are in our hand. But problem exists and we'll have to find solutions. So the question is, what lies on the other side of this transformation? If indeed this uncertainty, if indeed this not temporary disruption, but indeed the uncertainty is a structural transformation. And I would like to put it in that, in those words. And if indeed it is structural transformation, what lies on the other side? What will the new equilibrium look like? And who will shape it? And on what terms will it be shaped? These questions are not easily answered, as this equation has to be taking into consideration very many variables, not just a few, but many variables. Shifts that once transpired over decades are now condensed into months or even weeks. And tangled with these are the policymakers, wrestling with unforeseen challenges, searching for an equilibrium. So, by definition, epochal historical turning points do not come around every year. That's why they are epochal. For most of us, in our lifetime, the arc of history never bends. It is linear. We only see the upward slope, That is why we sometimes make the mistake of only seeing the upward slope, of projecting history linearly. This is also why confidence in continuing with the confidence in continuity has rapidly waned as we experience the arc of history bending now, giving way to pervasive doubt. The global economy itself reflects this. And how? Low investment, high cost of capital, volatile energy prices, and the ever-present tension between growth, stability, and sustainability. For decades, many Asian nations absorbed the material gains of globalization without adopting the same political values that represented or underpinned the Western society. Today, they assert alternative models of growth and governance, drawing on their civilizational continuities. Their emergence questions the assumption of the Western liberal values are the only path to economic success. These nations have become central pillars of the global order in economic, political, and technological terms. The absolute dominance once enjoyed by a hegemon is now contested. In this context, therefore, India's rise as a stabilizing force is neither accidental nor transient. Instead, it results from a powerful combination of various factors. Improved quality of capital expenditure and reining in inflationary pressures has been consistent. We have implemented strategic reforms that enhance the ease of doing business, promote financial inclusion, and improve the quality of life for the average citizen in the country. With the steady share of consumption and investment in the overall GDP over the years, India's growth is firmly anchored in its domestic factors, which minimizes the impact of external shocks on overall growth. As a result, the Indian economy is resilient, continues to grow sustainably. However, just as eternal vigilance is resilient, continues to grow sustainably. However, just as eternal vigilance is the price for liberty, eternal performance is the price of strategic independence. There is no room for complacency or self-regulation beyond a quiet confidence in our abilities to take the right decisions and to execute them. For many smaller developing nations, the current geopolitical environment poses fundamental questions. To be sure, there are risks and opportunities, but questions do loom large. Will the world remain unipolar? Or are we entering a truly multipolar age? If multipolarity is our future, what shape will it take? Will it be one of cooperative pluralism, where different models coexist? Or will it harden into rival blocs and spheres of influence? Getting back to the old jargon, forcing nations to pick sides. History offers no guarantees, but the possibility of a fragmented world with multiple centers of power and competing values appears to be more likely. So the trade-offs and imbalances, we need to spend a minute on that. So the questions that we asked are not abstract. They directly impact lives of our citizens. For nations still climbing the development ladder, the trade-offs are particularly acute between energy transition and energy security, between the imperative of growth and the urgency of sustainability. So these are questions which are hitting the common man's lives. Between the drive for innovation and the realities of the labor markets, rich with young populations, between attracting capital and the burden of high borrowing costs, between the demands of productive investments and the temptation of financialization. These trade-offs define our options. They're not easily resolved, yet they cannot be ignored. These trade-offs are accentuated in a world with trends desiring and with trends towards de-risking, decoupling, and hence slowing globalization. Globalization, economic integration, and immigration are not natural states of affairs. They can unravel under pressure as they have in the past. Today, we find ourselves in a shifting global landscape that resembles a zero-sum approach, in part, a consequence of the failures and limitations of the era of globalization that preceded it. So overlaying these in a world of profound imbalances, trade imbalances have hollowed out industries in some nations while creating overcapacity in others. Financial imbalances have concentrated wealth in speculative sectors while depriving the real economy of investment. Energy imbalances have made some societies chronically dependent on costly imports, even as others subsidize their industries with cheap, carbon-intensive power. Net zero commitments pursued with regard to trade-offs risk driving up costs for developing economies while constraining their growth. These imbalances have become structural features of our world, distorting incentives, fueling political discontent, and so on. So the task before us, therefore, is not simply to manage uncertainty, but to confront imbalances. We must ask ourselves, how can we build a global order where trade is fair, finance serves productive ends, energy is both affordable and sustainable, and climate action aligns with development imperatives? How can international institutions be reformed to reflect today's realities rather than yesterday's hierarchies? And crucially, how can the voices of developing nations, no longer marginalized in rulemaking, be amplified in shaping the future? The choices we face are stark, and already we see efforts to reimagine the global financial system itself. Innovations like stable coins are transforming the landscape of money and capital inflows. These shifts may force nations to make binary choices, adapt to new monetary architecture, or risk exclusion. Such developments underscore the scale of transformation which is underway. They also remind us that no nation can insulate itself from the systemic changes. Whether we welcome these shifts or not, we must prepare to engage with them. At the same time, geopolitical conflicts are intensifying. Sanctions, tariffs, and decoupling strategies are reshaping global supply chains. For India, these dynamics highlight both vulnerability and resilience. Our capacity to absorb shocks is strong, while our economic leverage is evolving. Our choices will determine whether resilience becomes a foundation for leadership or merely a buffer against uncertainty. So, in conclusion, history teaches us crises often precede renewal. The fragmentation we see today may give rise to more sustainable and unforeseen forms of cooperation. The challenge is to ensure that inclusive principles shape cooperation. For developing countries, this is a necessity, not just a romantic aspiration. We cannot afford to be passive spectators. In a world where decisions elsewhere determine our destinies, we must be active participants, shaping outcomes where possible and preserving autonomy where necessary. As we reflect on these issues, let us recognize that many of these questions I have raised today may not have clear answers. Indeed, it may be unwise to seek definitive answers at this stage. The value of this gathering lies precisely in its capacity to wrestle with uncertainty, recognize and examine imbalances, deliberate on trade-offs, particularly those of our time, and be open to the possibilities we may not have considered earlier. This must be the guiding vision for our takeaways from these 3-day conference. The themes before us are not isolated strands. They are a part of a single large tapestry. How we interpret this tapestry and how we choose to act with it will shape the contours of our century. It is a big ask and a big task. As more often than not, we tend to have a natural conflict of interest when contemplating adverse scenarios. If we accept them as possibilities, we must act and drastically refashion our lives. However, we must ask difficult questions and address their profound implications. If we are to make sense of seemingly inexplicable events, we have to stretch our mental faculties more than usual. Let us, therefore, treat this moment not only as a crisis but as an inflection point. Let us converse not only to ponder upon what future awaits us, but also to lay out the contours of the future we wish to create. And let us proceed with humility, that while history may sweep in wide arcs, the choices we make today will decide whether its currents carry us or help steer its course. Above all, let us weigh every possible option with intent and strive for constructive dialogue. In doing so, I think we'll ensure that the outcomes of this gathering can help sharpen our clarity and cast light on the shadows of an uncertain future.